Hello and welcome to Being Prodigy. Now put on your headphones and start learning. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description.
The war led to the snapping of economic links between some of the world's largest economic powers, which were now fighting each other to pay for them. So Britain borrowed large sums of money from U.S. banks as well as the U.S. public. Thus the war transformed the U.S. from being an international debtor to an international creditor. In other words, at the war's end, the U.S. and its citizens owned more overseas assets than foreign governments and citizens owned in the U.S. Post-war recovery. Post-war economic recovery proved difficult. Britain, which was the world's leading economy in the pre-war period, in particular faced a prolonged crisis. While Britain was preoccupied with war, industries had developed in India and Japan. After the war, Britain found it difficult to recapture its earlier position of dominance in the Indian market and to compete with Japan internationally. Moreover, to finance war expenditures, Britain had borrowed liberally from the U.S. This meant that at the end of the war, Britain was burdened with huge external debts. The war had led to an economic boom, that is, to a large increase in demand, production and employment. When the war boom ended, production contracted and unemployment increased. At the same time, the government reduced bloated war expenditures to bring them into line with peacetime revenues. These developments led to huge job losses. In 1921, 1 in every 5 British workers was out of work. Indeed, anxiety and uncertainty about work became an enduring part of the post-war scenario. Many agricultural economies were also in crisis. Consider the case of wheat producers. Before the war, Eastern Europe was a major supplier of wheat in the world market. When this supply was disrupted during the war, wheat production in Canada, America and Australia expanded dramatically. But once the war was over, production in Eastern Europe revived and created a glut in wheat output.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support.
Grain prices fell, rural incomes declined, and farmers fell deeper into debt. Rise of mass production and consumption in the U.S., recovery was quicker. We have already seen how the war helped boost the U.S. economy. After a short period of economic trouble in the years after the war, the U.S. economy resumed its strong growth in the early 1920s. One important feature of the U.S. economy of the 1920s was mass production. The move towards mass production had begun in the late 19th century, but in the 1920s it became a characteristic feature of industrial production in the U.S. A well-known pioneer of mass production was Thacker manufacturer Henry Ford. He adapted the assembly line of a Chicago slaughterhouse, in which slaughtered animals were picked apart by butchers as they came down a conveyor belt, to his new car plant in Detroit. He realized that the assembly line method would allow a faster and cheaper way of producing vehicles. The assembly line forced workers to repeat a single task mechanically and continuously, such as fitting a particular part to the car, at a pace dictated by the conveyor belt. This was a way of increasing the output per worker by speeding up the pace of work. Standing in front of a conveyor belt, no worker could afford to delay the motions, take a break, or even have a friendly word with a workmate. As a result, Henry Ford's cars came off the assembly line at 3-minute intervals, a speed much faster than that achieved by previous methods.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support.
The T model Ford was the world's first mass-produced car. At first, workers at the Ford factory were unable to cope with the stress of working on assembly lines in which they could not control the pace of work, so they quit in large numbers. In desperation, Ford doubled the daily wage to $5 in January 1914. At the same time, he banned trade unions from operating in his plants. Henry Ford recovered the high wage by repeatedly speeding up the production line and forcing workers to work ever harder. So much so, he would soon describe his decision to double the daily wage as the best cost-cutting decision he had ever made. Fordist industrial practices soon spread in the U.S. They were also widely copied in Europe in the 1920s. Mass production lowered costs and prices of engineered goods. Thanks to higher wages, more workers could now afford to purchase durable consumer goods such as cars. Car production in the U.S. rose from 2 million in 1919 to more than 5 million in 1929. The demand for refrigerators, washing machines, etc. was also fueled by a boom in house construction and home ownership, financed once again by loans. The housing and consumer boom of the 1920s created the basis of prosperity in the U.S. Large investments in housing and household goods seemed to create a cycle of higher employment and incomes, rising consumption demand, more investment, and yet more employment and incomes. In 1923, the U.S. resumed exporting capital to the rest of the world and became the largest overseas lender. U.S. imports and capital exports also boosted European recovery in world trade and income growth over the next 6 years. All this, however, proved too good to last. By 1929, the world would be plunged into a depression such as it had never experienced before. The Great Depression began around 1929 and lasted till the mid-1930s.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description, and please subscribe to show your support.
During this period, most parts of the world experienced catastrophic declines in production, employment, incomes, and trade. The exact timing and impact of the depression varied across countries, but in general, agricultural regions and communities were the worst affected. This was because the fall in agricultural prices was greater and more prolonged than that in the prices of industrial goods. The depression was caused by a combination of several factors. We have already seen how fragile the post-war world economy was. First, agricultural overproduction remained a problem. This was made worse by falling agricultural prices. As prices slumped and agricultural incomes declined, farmers tried to expand production and bring a larger volume of produce to the market to maintain their overall income. This worsened the glut in the market, pushing down prices even further. Farm produce rotted for a lack of buyers. Second, in the mid-1920s, many countries financed their investments through loans from the U.S. While it was often extremely easy to raise loans in the U.S. when the going was good, U.S. overseas lenders panicked at the first sign of trouble. In the first half of 1928, U.S. overseas loans amounted to over $1 billion. A year later it was 1/4 of that amount. Countries that depended crucially on U.S. loans now faced an acute crisis. The withdrawal of U.S. loans affected much of the rest of the world, though in different ways. In Europe it led to the failure of some major banks and the collapse of currencies such as the British pound sterling. In Latin America and elsewhere it intensified the slump in agricultural and raw material prices. The U.S. attempt to protect its economy in the Depression by doubling import duties also dealt another severe blow to world trade. The U.S. was also the industrial country most severely affected by the Depression. With the fall in prices and the prospect of a depression, U.S. banks had also slashed domestic lending and called back loans. Farms could not sell their harvests, households were ruined, and businesses collapsed. Faced with falling incomes, many households in the U.S. could not repay what they had borrowed, and were forced to give up their homes, cars, and other consumer durables. The consumerist prosperity of the 1920s now disappeared in a puff of dust. As unemployment soared, people trudged long distances looking for any work they could find. Ultimately, the U.S. banking system itself collapsed. Unable to recover investments, collect loans, and repay depositors, thousands of banks went bankrupt and were forced to close. The numbers are phenomenal. By 1933, over 4,000 banks had closed, and between 1929 and 1932, about 110,000 companies had collapsed. By 1935, a modest economic recovery was underway in most industrial countries, but the Great Depression's wider effects on society, politics, and international relations, and on people's minds, proved more enduring. India and the Great Depression. If we look at the impact of the Depression on India, we realize how integrated the global economy had become by the early 20th century. The tremors of a crisis in one part of the world were quickly relayed to other parts, affecting lives, economies, and societies worldwide. In the 19th century, as you have seen, colonial India had become an exporter of agricultural goods and importer of manufactures. The Depression immediately affected Indian trade.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description, and please subscribe to show your support.
India's exports and imports nearly halved between 1928 and 1934. As international prices crashed, prices in India also plunged. Between 1928 and 1934, wheat prices in India fell by 50%. Peasants and farmers suffered more than urban dwellers. Though agricultural prices fell sharply, the colonial government refused to reduce revenue demands. Peasants producing for the world market were the worst hit. Consider the jute producers of Bengal. They grew raw jute that was processed in factories for export in the form of gunny bags. But as gunny exports collapsed, the price of raw jute crashed more than 60%. Peasants who borrowed in the hope of better times or to increase output in the hope of higher incomes faced ever lower prices and fell deeper and deeper into debt. Thus the Bengal jute growers lament. Across India, peasants' indebtedness increased. They used up their savings, mortgaged lands, and sold whatever jewelry and precious metals they had to meet their expenses. In these depression years, India became an exporter of precious metals, notably gold. The famous economist John Maynard Keynes thought that Indian gold exports promoted global economic recovery. They certainly helped speed up Britain's recovery, but did little for the Indian peasant. Rural India was thus seething with unrest when Mahatma Gandhi launched the civil disobedience movement at the height of the Depression in 1931. The Depression proved less grim for urban India. Because of falling prices, those with fixed incomes, say town-dwelling landowners who received rents and middle-class salaried employees, now found themselves better off. Everything cost less. Industrial investment also grew as the government extended tariff protection to industries, under the pressure of nationalist opinion. Rebuilding a world economy, the post-war era. The Second World War broke out a mere 2 decades after the end of the First World War. It was fought between the Axis powers, mainly Nazi Germany, Japan and Italy, and the Allies, Britain, France, the Soviet Union and the US. It was a war waged for 6 years on many fronts, in many places, over land, on sea, in the air. Once again death and destruction was enormous. At least 60 million people, or about 3% of the world's 1939 population, are believed to have been killed, directly or indirectly, as a result of the war. Millions more were injured. Unlike in earlier wars, most of these deaths took place outside the battlefields. Many more civilians than soldiers died from war-related causes. Vast parts of Europe and Asia were devastated, and several cities were destroyed by aerial bombardment or relentless artillery attacks.
This is Being Prodigy. To get special study material, just contact us through the link in the description. And please subscribe to show your support. Thank you and happy learning.